called dominant strategy of this game. So whatever Russia plays, whether it de-escalates or escalates, we should escalate. And of course, it's a symmetrical game. So Russia says, whatever the US does, we should escalate. And so what is the so-called equilibrium of this game predicted by game theory and essentially built into the tragedy of great powers? Both sides escalate. That's Mearsheimer's point, that is the rational action to take if each side is playing for its advantage, taking as given what the other country is doing. So both sides escalate. We have a war in Ukraine, and both sides lose. Of course, Ukraine loses the most. So I don't have this really depicting exactly the Ukraine war, I want to be clear. But the idea is that the US and Russia both escalate. What does this mean in practice? The US pushes NATO enlargement, and Russia pushes war to stop NATO enlargement. And you end up with a disaster for both sides. You look at that and say, guys, could you sit down and have a look? This isn't working very well for you. You're stuck in a disaster. Wouldn't it be good for both of you to chill, sit down, maybe US, I have an idea, don't expand NATO, just stay out. Russia, go home. Let Ukraine live. Stop fighting over Ukraine. And actually, US, you'll be better off. You'll have 5. Russia, you'll be better off. You'll have 5. And that is actually the right answer for my first proposition, that international relations theory should be a theory of how to get to de-escalate, not a theory of why we end up at escalate. We don't have that theory now. If you say, as I do every day, why don't you negotiate? Well, you're called a Putin apologist. You're denied access to the Western media. You're deemed to be a fool, and so forth. Frankly, we are in a tragedy. We are in the tragedy of great power politics, and it's getting worse. Because as Mearsheimer rightly says, you don't just end up with a static -5, you end up with continuing escalation. The end of continuing escalation is nuclear war. There's nothing beyond that. But there's nothing that stops the escalation to that. If Ukraine were really to be armed to invade Crimea, well, there would then be nuclear war. You would be told moments before we all are destroyed, don't worry about it. My advice to you is worry about it, because we don't want to get there. So the idea is we need to move from the bottom right cell to the top left cell, because it's mutually beneficial, but we don't have an international relations theory that is adequate for this. That's what we are searching for. I believe that there are 2 answers to that. In game theory, there is a famous finding, and the famous finding is if you let people playing the prisoner's dilemma talk with each other before they play, even without any binding agreement, they will cooperate 90% of the time. And so the mere human touch of negotiation changes the game fundamentally, even though it's not binding. And this, I believe, is key. How many times has President Biden spoken with President Putin during the year since the war started? I'll give you a hint. It's less than 1. And it's an integer. It is 0. So this is not grown up, 5-year-olds would do better. So I believe that the two answers to this, first is a point that John F. Kennedy made in his inaugural address, same speech, where he said, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. We need to sit down to talk. It's surprising how talking is a human activity that makes a substantive difference in allowing a solution to a social dilemma. The other is a point that Ronald Reagan emphasized. Agreement is not based on trust. It's not based on naivete. It is trust but verify. Finally, let me turn to the third kind of war, and that is interethnic violence and the social structures of fear. Intercommunal violence is a special kind of war. It is conflict amplified by group identity, with very little communication between groups, open hostility, typically long-lasting, very high fear factors on both sides. Both sides are typically prisoners of history. As my wife says, those who can't forget history are condemned to repeat it, the opposite of the usual idea. When you are stuck in intercommunal conflict, if you can't forget the past, that they did this to us, then there is the constant provocation that more will come and that it's impossible to reach peace. There are very few structures of protection for communities, so the fear is very, very high. And we don't have a developed jurisprudence or political structure in most of history about group rights, which we need. So the United States does not have a concept of group rights, for example. In fact, we're now going to probably see the end of so-called affirmative action in the United States because it violates individual rights, will be the Supreme Court's likely decision. We don't have a concept of how in a diverse, multi-ethnic community, different ethnicities can have rights. Actually, the Ottoman Empire, in my view, did a pretty good job of this. The Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic community with a millet system in which there was self-jurisdiction to an important extent of non-Muslim populations and rights to practice religions within that. These non-Muslim populations were not of the social stature of the Muslim populations in the Ottoman period, but they had an autonomy and they had a governance structure. They paid taxes, the millet taxes, but there were group rights, and those group rights were important. We've lost even the search for group rights in our, I think, ideologies of liberalism and in our constitutional designs. And this makes intercommunal conflict more likely and persistent. Fear is a deep driver of this. I don't have time to elaborate, but there are wonderful articles by psychologists, social psychologists, neuroscientists, and conflict resolution specialists emphasizing the role of fear really as a subcortical, fast, reactive kind of decision-making. To move from the lower right cell in conflict to the upper left cell in cooperation is a cognitive act. It's not an emotional act, it's a cognitive act. And fear derails that kind of cognitive act to an important extent. So what are some potential partial answers which nobody has found? I would say first, group rights, especially for minority groups within a political framework. The search for universals in ethics, and I think that's where Allama Iqbal really comes into this. An ethics of tolerance, which is a special kind of ethics, which I'll come to in a moment. Intergroup dialogue, social and political structures of mediation, and shared culture, which is extremely important. Arts, sports, music, literature. I really object to and disagree fundamentally with the call, for example, of excluding Russian athletes from the 2024 Olympics. This is the opposite of what we need to find peace in the world. And the Ukrainian demands to exclude Russian athletes or to stop playing Tchaikovsky or to stop Russian ballets is mind-bogglingly wrong. It's the opposite of what we need for peace. So I am a huge believer that ancient wisdom can help us to find solutions, whether it is Confucius or the Buddha or Aristotle or Averroes, shown in the lower right, or the prophet Isaiah as imagined by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. There is a commonality of views across the great faiths that I think is what Allama Iqbal was searching for, and that is vital if we're going to find an end to this kind of conflict. So I would argue that there are at least 6 shared pillars of ancient wisdom across the Greeks, Jewish and Christian traditions, Islamic faith, Buddhism, Hinduism, and other ancient wisdom traditions. First, they're all based on virtue ethics, that the way to well-being is by building our characters, which I think is a fundamental point. It was not the dominant form of ethics in the English and Germanic world in the last 3 centuries, but it's making a very strong comeback. And I think virtue ethics is the right form of ethics, more than deontological or utilitarian ethics, because it puts ethics as the core of individual responsibility, like you quoted Iqbal as emphasizing. Second, it emphasizes that humans struggle between lower urges, let's cheat and take advantage, and a higher calling, let's cooperate because that's the right thing to do. It calls on reason of various kinds as being fundamental on the path to reaching that higher calling. It says